Hi everybody, and welcome to another One History Help video with me, Mrs. O'Neill. This is the first of several videos that we're going to be having a look at focusing on the causes of the Second World War. It's all part of AQA's Conflict and Tension section looking at the interwar years 1919 to 1939. This first video, as you can see, is all about Hitler's aims in foreign policy, and it's going to outline for us some of the overview causes of the Second World War as well. This here is a timeline that I give to all of my students when I begin teaching the causes of the Second World War. And at first it looks a little bit overwhelming because we've got a lot of events here, and as we can see, as the timeline goes on, it gets very heavy with lots of events happening in the same years. However, I do reassure my students as well that although it does look like a lot of detail, we will learn that a lot of these events link together, and the better we can link events together, the stronger our memory about them will be. Also, although we're seeing them all as individual events here, what we will also go on to do is look at how they also fit into certain groups and certain categories as well. And again, when we approach it that way, it seems a lot less intimidating. This diagram that I'm going to go through with you here very much demonstrates what I was referring to before when we talk about the categories or groups of causes that contributed towards the Second World War. Hitler's actions are a significant cause of the Second World War, and a lot of the content that we're going to be looking at in our videos focuses on what he was doing in the 1930s leading up to the outbreak of war in September 1939. Britain and France's policy of appeasement is also a really significant factor in why World War II happened, and very much links into the actions that Hitler took. I'm going to talk more about that link a little bit later on in this video today. The League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles are also both causes of the Second World War as well. The reason I've put them in brackets here is because for those of you who are watching because you are looking at AQA's GCSE History, Conflict and Tension course, we already teach the League of Nations and Treaty of Versailles as two separate causes. The whole interwar era about these things running along at the same time. And the reason I put them in brackets here is because in the event you are writing, say, a 16-mark question, 20-mark question, looking at why World War II happened, writing specifically about the actions of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles isn't going to necessarily work in an AQA GCSE situation because they have already got discrete specific questions on the League of Nations and Treaty of Versailles that they would want you to answer. You can still mention them, you can still refer to them, but you can't, for instance, base one of your paragraphs on the weaknesses of the League of Nations or the long-term cause of the Treaty of Versailles as well. Any of you who are watching this video, however, looking at the causes of World War II in general, you absolutely can acknowledge the weaknesses of the League of Nations and the long-term how can I put it, bitterness that was set up through the Treaty of Versailles as well. Just from a GCSE AQA history point of view, personally, I would recommend my students to leave those two as specific causes to write a paragraph about. In the series of videos I'm going to be producing on the causes of World War II, we will be coming back to Hitler's actions and appeasement in a lot more detail. This video, however, is all about understanding Hitler's foreign policy, and that will help us understand the idea of Hitler's actions in the causes of the Second World War as well. But what do we actually mean by this term foreign policy? Foreign policy is a government strategy in dealing with other nations. And the best way I feel to explain that is looking at the opposite. The opposite of this is domestic policy, which is a government strategy for its own country. So, for instance, those of you who have studied looking at America in the 20th century, things like the New Deal that Roosevelt ran in the 1930s would be an example of domestic policy. However, for those of you maybe who've got a little bit of knowledge surrounding possibly the Cold War, things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, things like the Vietnam War, they would be considered as foreign policy. They're not two discrete groups, they're more like a Venn diagram, as there's lots of times when both foreign policy and domestic policy do cross over with each other. But for the purpose of what we're looking at in this video here, when we're looking at Hitler's foreign policy, we're looking at how he looked from the inside out, so from within Germany, and the impact it could have on other nations as well. Hitler had three main aims for his foreign policy. The first one was to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. Some of you may be watching this video now and may have been studying Hitler, Nazi Germany, Weimar Germany and everything like that as part of your depth study for paper 1, and therefore you may well already be aware of this, but the idea of getting rid of the Treaty of Versailles was something that Hitler really put into his election campaign in the early 1930s. Hitler is elected to power in 1933, and one of the big things that he promised the German people, along many other things, was that he was going to get rid of the Treaty of Versailles. To use a well-used phrase of the 21st century, he was going to make Germany great again. He was going to right all of the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles, a very much a long-term undercurrent of bitterness and resentment amongst the German people since its signing in 1919. He knew he would be able to prey on this. It was something he also very strongly believed in, and something, as we will see when we look into the 1930s, is one of those rare moments in history where a politician sticks to his words, because abolishing the Treaty of Versailles is something that he gets to pretty much straight away. So abolishing the Treaty of Versailles is objective number 1. In no particular priority order, but objective number 1, getting rid of the Treaty of Versailles. The second one was to conquer Lebensraum. One of my later videos is going to go through Lebensraum in a bit more detail, but just as a brief overview, Lebensraum is a German term meaning living room or living space. It was all about expanding German territory, especially towards the east. So he wasn't as interested in expanding German territory towards the west, towards France, for instance, but he was more interested in expanding eastwards. And the reason that he wanted to go east was because there was his number 1 enemy there that he wanted to defeat, which was communism. Aim number 3 was to get rid of communism. For those of you, again, who studied the Nazis as part of your history depth study, you will already know that in 1933 Hitler knew his biggest rivals were the communists in power in Germany itself, but he also knew that communism was a very alluring, a very appealing ideology to a lot of the people that he had fought in his campaigning to win round the working class. So Hitler saw communism as a scourge on humanity, and his big aim was to get rid of it. So defeating communism was a big part of that, and that was why conquering Lebensraum was very much focused on moving east towards Russia. Another part of conquering Lebensraum was about expanding German territory, getting it back from what was lost in the Treaty of Versailles, but also about expanding the master race as well. This idea of getting extra living space, living territory for this pure Aryan race. One of those moments, like I said, when foreign policy and domestic policy very much overlap. Everything that Hitler was doing in Germany itself to do with getting rid of undesirables, quote unquote, which would be domestic policy, very much crosses over with this idea of him trying to get this larger, I'm not going to use the phrase empire because I don't think that would be particularly accurate for this, but this larger living space for this pure Aryan race. Again, where these two things are crossing over with each other. These 3 aims in foreign policy are something that we will keep coming back to in our videos looking at the causes of the Second World War. I showed you this beforehand, and one of the things I wanted to bring to your attention was that we can now break Hitler's actions down into some subcategories, into 2 subgroups. That is conquering Lebensraum and the rearmament program as well. So when we're thinking of the causes of the Second World War overall, and we're thinking about Hitler's actions in particular, we're very much going to look at it from those 2 points of view. So rearmament and conquering Lebensraum are the way that we can divide Hitler's actions into 2 separate categories. Again, appeasement is going to play a really big role in Hitler being able to do many of these things, much like the weaknesses of the League of Nations in the 1930s enable Hitler to achieve these things as well. So what I would often encourage my students to do once I'd taught them about what the main overriding factors and causes of the Second World War are and Hitler's aims in foreign policy is to have a look at the timeline that we've looked at from earlier on, the main one that I would have given to my students right at the beginning, and start to see where some of these are appearing. So for instance, if we're going with the left-hand diagram, where can you see moments of Hitler abolishing the Treaty of Versailles? When can you see him conquering Lebensraum, taking over territory? Where can you see this idea of defeating communism coming through? It may well be in the early stages, you can't quite see where they are because, again, a lot of them are there just as a phrase. However, if you are looking at this from a revision point of view, which is why a lot of you will be watching these videos, I know, you want to look in terms of what can you remember about these causes? Where does it fit into, again, those three objectives: abolishing the Treaty of Versailles, conquering Lebensraum, defeating communism? If you're thinking about it from the point of view of why World War II happened as a larger question, you might want to think of that little flow diagram on the right hand side there and think, where do I see Hitler's actions in this timeline? Where do I see him rearming Germany? Where do I see this idea of conquering Lebensraum? And where do I see appeasement coming into it as well? Again, I would be using this as a colour coding opportunity for the timeline that I've got presented. So suddenly this massive timeline with all of these individual dates seems a lot less intimidating when you're looking for things that group together. This is also the main topic where students say, I can never get my head round when things happen. I'm always really nervous about getting dates wrong. And the big thing I would recommend for looking at the causes of World War II is all about understanding the order that events happen in. So for instance, knowing that, let's just pick two out here, shall we? Knowing that the Munich Agreement happens after the invasion of the Rhineland. So getting those in your head first and then getting to the dates. I've also got a video on this channel as well, all about the best way to remember dates, and it goes along with that principle. So remember the order first, then look for the specific dates from there. One final thing that I want to leave you with, and something that I'll be coming back to during the videos on the causes of World War II, is this historian here, A.J.P. Taylor, really famous historian. If any of you guys go on to learn about history at A-level or maybe even beyond A-level into university level as well, and especially if you look at modern history, you will definitely come across A.J.P. Taylor. He is a really famous historian who is commenting especially on the interwar years and looking at why World War II happened. Now, when we look at events like a timeline, it can make it look like Hitler had everything planned out from the very start. And that is actually what people believed up until around about the 1960s. So from when World War II started, effectively, for about 20 years, people believed that Hitler, as soon as he came to power in 1933, had war on his mind, that World War II is what he was aiming for. However, Taylor, in the 1960s, comes up with a new interpretation. And his interpretation stated that Hitler was a gambler more than he was a planner. Hitler simply took the next logical step to see what he could get away with. He was bold and he kept his nerve. As other countries gave in to him and allowed him to get away with each gamble, so he became bolder and risked more. And this is a great example of how this idea of Hitler's actions and appeasement very much go hand in hand with each other. I like to liken Taylor's interpretation here to a situation which I'm sure as students you can all identify with, which is when you get a new teacher for the very first time. And when you get a new teacher for the first time, and I know this because I've been in this situation myself, you test them, don't you? You test to see what can you get away with. And you test to see, oh, okay, well, if I do this and I've been allowed to get away with it, can I do something more than that? And will they let me get away with that? How far am I going to have to push until I know where their limits are? And that's exactly what Hitler was doing during the 1930s, according to Taylor's interpretation here. He was gambling, not planning. There's lots of other historical evidence that suggests that Hitler never actually planned, especially, a war with Britain. That Hitler actually very much admired Britain and wasn't interested in fighting Britain. The people we know for a fact from looking at his aims of foreign policy that he knew he wanted to defeat were the communists in the East. Also, he was very much intended on fighting France at some point or another, but when he comes into power in 1933, World War II is not on his mind necessarily. Making Germany strong again, from a point of view of rearmament, is definitely a big part of that, and that's the next video that I'm going to be speaking to you guys about. Thank you very much for listening to this video here as an introduction to the causes of World War II. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you are going to find the other videos that I'm going to be recording useful as well. Remember to like the videos. That really helps me to understand in terms of things that I'm doing that might be really useful in other videos as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as well so you get some updates about when videos are sent through. You can follow me on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm most active on Instagram at the moment though, and you can find me there at One History Help. And I'm on Facebook as well, but Instagram is probably the main place that I'm most active, I would say. Thank you so much for your time, everybody. Good luck with your Causes of World War II revision, and like I said, I hope my other videos help you out with that as well.